Hi, I'm Paul Marcel. So today we're going to talk about how to make the tapered octagon in the back of the table. The tapered octagon in the back is created by just a series of triangles that we're going to be gluing up and forming the octagon. Now, to do the calculation of these compound angles, there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. In my case, I wrote an application as part of my Angle Madness project that I ran on the iPad that simply allows me to enter some of the parameters like top diameter, bottom diameter, height, number of sides, things like that. And it pops out with the miter angle and the bevel angle that goes along with it to accomplish the piece that you described. But there are a number of resources online that you can do to get various numbers like this. Now, I will recommend that if you go online and find some online calculator, find two and make sure that the numbers match. Now, cutting these parts, a lot of times when people think of compound angles, they immediately assume that you're going to use a sliding compound miter saw, since that's typically what you do when you're cutting things like molding. Now, molding is really nice and long, or base molding, crown molding, any of that, really long. So you're making a small cut on the end of something that you have plenty of room to hang on to. In the case of something like this, I would really not want to be hanging on to this part here and cutting right there to make this compound cut. And also, I find that the table saw can be much more accurate. Now, to cut these compound angles, I used a sled that I created for my Angle Madness project. Now, overall, there's nothing too special about it. It's just a cross-cut sled, but a lot of the ideas of how you use it, how you create fences on it, is what I ended up using here and what was used in Angle Madness. So, rather than go over all the stuff that's involved in this and how the triangles worked, I'll refer you to my Angle Madness project. If you take a look at the third video called The Jigs, you'll see how this was created, how the triangles are created, used, and corrected, actually, for high accuracy. So now the general idea is that when you're using that cross-cut sled, what you want to do is you want to create a fence that you can register to repeatedly for all these different cuts. So they're all going to be identical. If you're off by a hair on the angle, at least they're all going to be off the same amount, which is a heck of a lot better than a bunch of random angles. So what I did is I took the miter angle value that came out of the iPad application, and then I took a rectangle, and then I drew that angle here. So this is the angle, the miter angle. If we were to put this on here, this being one of the cut parts, you can see that that matches up. I place this on the MFT, put the track right on it, so I don't care what the angle is. All I do is I put the track right on the line and cut it. So this is what I've got. This may not be the exact angle that I measured and marked out with the Angle Master, but it's going to be consistent across the entire octagon. Now, I color-coded the angles because we're going to be doing some cuts at the table saw, and I want you to be able to know which one's the miter angle and which one is the complement. So the miter angle, the one that matches the pieces that we're cutting, are labeled in red. The blue is the complement that allows you to get to 180 degrees. And you can see that across the cut, the reds and blues swap positions. So I labeled them on both sides. So in effect, these two pieces are the same. If I rotate one around and line it up, the cut is the same. That's always going to be the case when we make a cut like this. So we have two sets of fences that we can use. Now, the method that I used for cutting these triangles requires that you just use these as fences. And actually, the whole thing about complementary angles and which one's the miter angle and all that stuff, don't even worry about that. We don't have to worry about that when we go to do the cut. It can become very mechanical. So that's perfect, and you don't have to think about it too much, so reduces your error. And also, we don't have to get into any math mumbo-jumbo. So these become the fences for the parts that we're going to be cutting. What we're going to do is we're going to line this up on the cross-cut fence, so the bottom of the cross-cut sled is going to be here. And then we're going to take a part that has a straight edge on it. It only needs one straight reference surface, and line it up like this in order to make one cut. And then we do some stacking with these fences in order to make the second cut. So now, rather than cutting up this other scrap of curly cherry, I'm going to go ahead and use a piece of MDF for showing the cuts over at the table saw and walk you through the process so you can see how easy this can be done. So I took a piece of MDF, it's got the one straight edge, and I took the jigsaw to give it all these rounded edges so that we can show how just the one reference edge, we're going to be able to cut out of it a triangle that's got the right bevel angle and the right miters. Now, there is one thing that's worth mentioning now before we get to all the cuts, because I'm sure some of you are thinking about this, is I mentioned that when we cut this triangle, it doesn't matter if I'm off by a hair, at least all of them are going to be consistently off. The problem with that is that if we took all 8 sides of this octagon and then we stack it all up at the end, if the miter angle was wrong or the bevel angle was wrong, what we're going to find is that we're going to have either a gap on the inside or we're going to have a gap on the outside. because it's not really going to close up properly. It's got to be exactly precise in order for all those surfaces to remain flat and glue up properly. Knowing that, what I did with this is I created 7 sides. The 8th side was left to last. And then I filled in the 8th side by actually measuring directly off the project. So I didn't care what the angles were going to be. I measured directly off of what I needed. So this will be a very useful technique for you, and we'll cover this in a separate video, a small short video, just because it can be usable outside this project for sure. If you were to make something like a 28-sided cylinder or some crazy thing like that for a project, well, that last 28th side is going to have all the errors all compounding together. So at the end, it's not going to have the last piece fit perfectly. So what we can do is we can measure directly off the project to figure out both the compound angles, bevel, and the miter needed to make a part that exactly fits. It's really easy to do. It's just not something you do on a daily basis, thankfully. Now there is another secret about this project that nobody knows even by following the build video, and that is this really isn't an octagon. Now the miter was calculated off the program, and then I set the bevel according to what the program was, but then I made it a little bit more shallow. So in a way, if you look at it from the top, you could almost say it's like a 9.5 sided column that tapers. The reason why I did that is on a normal octagon, you're going to have the 2 sides on the outside are going to be parallel. In the case of this table, that means that the legs that are mounted on the outside are going to go directly out straight. That means that when they go down to the floor, they're going to be at risk of bumping into the base molding or shoe molding, whatever you've got in your house. So by making it a little bit more shallow and making it kind of a 9.5 sided octagon equivalent as far as the angles are concerned, those outside legs, instead of the sides being parallel like that, they're just angling in a little bit so that the legs take off away from the wall. So they just take off away from the wall enough to give clearance that I can push this up against the wall and I don't have any problem with the molding on the floor. So it's kind of funny that I use these super precision tools to set the bevel angle, and then after that I just give it a little nudge by hand in order to accomplish that, but it works just fine in the end. All right, let's get to some action. Over to the table saw. So now over at the table saw, I've removed the guards and all that so we can get a little better view of what's going on. But of course, I do my own stunts, so make sure that you keep your guards on. Normally mine's on all the time. Now the way this technique works, we have the one straight edge on the side, and basically what we're going to do is we're going to be putting this triangle so that it's parallel to that. The center line of the triangle is parallel to the outside edge. So what I did is I matched the bevel to this board. Doesn't matter how accurate we are, I'm just trying to do this as a demo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a center line on this board so we can see where this triangle is going to go. Now with the center line, we're going to get the center line to match this triangle. Now of course we wouldn't normally have this triangle in advance, but we have all the numbers. So what I did in the initial build was I went ahead and I drew a center line, and then I drew what this triangle would be based on the numbers. So you can easily set yourself a square line up here, put the width of the triangle as calculated, and then just draw using the miter angle that's on this block as a guide. That'll work just fine for you for drawing it out. So let me go ahead and do that. Now since I don't have the numbers from my iPad app here, I just took some measurements off of here. It's 70 millimeters across here, and then I simply use this to mark the distance. That's how you would mark it with the actual measurements, and then just draw the angles. These angle lines don't have to be dead accurate at all, because these are actually what are going to set the miter angle that we're going to cut. Now to do the cut, when we have this one reference edge that's straight, you can see that what we can do is we can place it on this sled, and we can use one of these 2 blocks to create a fence. No matter what, you're going to register the block itself, this sort of fence block, you're going to register it flat to the bottom. Okay, so you're either going to use this angled edge, or you're going to flip this and use this angled edge. And then we're actually going to stack it. Now for the first cut, all we need is one of these blocks. So let me pick the one that's a little bit wider so we have better registration. Now when you cut this, you're going to be cutting the outside edge first, because then that becomes your new reference surface for cutting this one here. You can't cut this one here and then have this as a reference edge. That's nothing. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut this one as our first reference edge. Now my saw is a left tilt saw, so when I have this triangle on here as an example of what they look like, you can see that the bevel is angled correctly for me to cut this outside edge if I have the board in this orientation. So now from the overhead cam, it's going to be easier for you to see. I'm trying to cut along this outside line here. So basically, I need to somehow get it kind of close to that. So with this lined up to look like it's pretty much going to go straight into the blade, I can see that if I place this one here all the way down to the bottom and slid it across, that reference, it matches up perfectly. This is going to set the correct angle for that outside cut. So now using this sled, I can simply lock down the stock and the triangle that's being used as reference. But the thing is we need to pick the correct placement for this triangle. Now, this is something that's interesting with it being on an angle. You could sit here and you could mess around with moving both of these until you have this directly lined up into the fence, but we don't need to do that. We can get it close so that this cut line is on the outside edge of this blade, and then we can lock this reference block into place. But now, because it's on an angle, I can slide this up and down, and this line is moving parallel. It's going to be sliding itself on one side or the other of the blade. So it actually makes it really easy that once I have this in the right place, I can eyeball straight down this cut line and see where the blade is going to be cutting. And then if I need to move it over just a hair, I can advance it, or I can retract it, and then lock it in place when I'm done. Now with everything all tightened up, the fence and the part, I can pretty much be out on the side here and push it through. Let me go ahead and cut this. Now as you can see, as that cut was going through, it was exactly removing that line. So you can even be very, very accurate just by eyeballing straight down that blade. And you'll get a little bit of practice doing that when you're doing some projects like this. The first cut takes one fence block, the second cut takes two. So I'm going to put this on here. That's approximately the orientation that we need. That's going to make a straight cut down that line where I want it. Now, how do I stack these fences up to get it? I can put one like this, and then I can put the other one like this. Hey, that looks about right. So once I get all these fences squared up, I'm going to re-register this. So let me get this out here. And again, the way I place this on here, I can slide this like this to be able to get the line to line up with the cut so I can eyeball straight down the blade. So let me do just that. Now we make the cut. And now you can see where I had that cross line on the top. I pretty much got an exact part that matched that. So now I just would have to repeat that and go through to make all the other parts. It goes very quickly when you have this type of a setup. And then once you have this one, now you can trace this onto your next piece. So you have the correct angles on there for the next line of sight that you're going to be doing. So now you'll notice that when I cut these triangles, I never did bother actually trimming off the top. There was really no need for doing that. I didn't care if there was all this extra material because as you saw in the video, the build video, I built a jig that let me basically lop off the top of the whole octagon after it was created. So it saved all the time of making these cuts and doing those at an appropriate bevel. So the next thing to do was to take all of these and domino them to assemble them together. Remember that there's a lot of end grain on here, and simply doing something where I glued it all up and then pushed it together, that would be fine if you're not putting a lot of structural support on it. But in this case here, it's hanging onto the legs and it's hanging onto a cantilevered top. So there's a fair amount of torque happening in different areas of this octagon. So I needed to make sure that I reinforced it, so that was the role of the dominoes here. So back when I was building this, I recorded a small segment that explained how the dominoes went in and some of the tricks I used for making sure that they matched up equally. So this is a good trick that you can use when you have some dominoes that don't quite go right. All right, roll it. So as I get ready to do a little bit more work on this octagon, I wanted to explain a couple things that I did special with doing the dominoes on it. Now I used 5mm dominoes on it and I made all the marks and I assembled it all together, but if you paid attention to the video, it looked like I went back and I remortised it all. And you can see that this is actually really, really loose. So there's got to be something I did to that. So if we take a look at just one of the sets of facets here, what I did originally is I just took one of these boards here, pushed it up against the domino fence, and I tried to set the fence position to the edge here so that I would get the correct angle. Now there's a relatively small registration surface here, and when you're looking at it, the way that the fence, the mortising head area, it's not really flat the whole way, it's not the full width. It makes it hard to really get it dead right when you're just setting it against a board like this. Now, in a separate project I'm doing, my Angle Madness, I actually created a setup block for all the multitude of bevels that I needed to do mortising against. So with this, I actually have such a big surface, it was really easy to do the mortising, and they were all perfect. Now, taking the time to do that on this little project didn't really make much sense. So what I did is I set it the best I could, went ahead and did all the domino mortises according to the lines that I had here, and then I assembled it with 5mm dominoes. The outside looked fantastic. The inside had a hairline crack down the middle. It wasn't even that much, but it was a hairline. And I could have left it because it makes no difference in this project whatsoever. But I thought I would show in these videos how you can correct a small problem like that and make it basically go away without having to push dominoes in, glue them in, cut them off, try it again, monkey with the setup, make a big setup block, nothing like that. The simple solution for this was I then went back with the dominoes still at the same height setting and with the fence still at the same angle that I had originally set. I swapped out the 5mm bit for a 6mm bit, and then I remortised only one side of the joint. So now this side here, the holes are bigger, so when I put this thing together, I got plenty of extra slop so that when I go to do the glue up, I'm going to use tape across this joint to keep it nice and snug, and then I'll close this one here up and just put a piece of tape across the top. You're going to see all this, or you would have already seen all this in the no comment build, and that's going to keep it just perfect when it assembles it. But now the question is, well, that's sort of silly though. Now I've got this, while this domino is nice and tight on one side, the other side it's swimming in an open hole. It's not going to do anything. So what I do in a case like this where I need to make a correction for a domino that's just not quite right, and I put a larger hole or a thinner domino, what I'll do is I'll fill this hole here with epoxy that's been thickened. So there I can put a little bit of that inside these two holes, and when I push this thing together, the epoxy is going to fill all the open void, and basically I've got a perfectly fitted tenon. I was so tempted to do that flashback intro in a Count Floyd voice. So normally we don't have a way of seeing inside the joint, but because of the way that I lopped off the top of the octagon, I actually have some offcuts that show a cross section of these dominoes that were glued in. So here we can see how on one side of the joint, this one here and this, that's a 5mm domino in a 5mm hole. The other side is a 6mm hole, so there's extra room. But you can see how the epoxy filled that joint just perfectly. And because it's a structural epoxy, it's not flexible, it's not going to do anything like that. It just hardened up in there and basically made a perfectly matched 6mm tenon out of the 5. So, and you can see how well these miters all closed up. They're all perfect, even though honestly to get that exactly right with the domino fence might be a little bit tricky to do. But this trick makes it that the bevel angles always come out fantastic. Now all these triangles, when I was working with them, I had a center line marked on them. Sometimes it was just some ticks on the back. Using that center mark on here, I took the Domizilla to mortise a hole that went as far as I could get it in here. The intention there was that I was going to be, when I would slice the parts off, I would have a piece above here and a piece down here. I would have a matching hole in the tabletop, and I could ram a domino all the way through with a piece on the top, the tabletop, and into here. Now that was discussed in the design video as something I intended to do, but when I cut the parts and I looked at it, it didn't look as good as this, so I went ahead and changed it. This is a benefit that you have with something like the Domizilla, where it's got a plunge length of 75mm, is that you can really make a long plunge that you can then split and turn into the two halves, so you can cut things spatially. Now when I did the plunge for that, I simply put this down on the tabletop, and then I put the Domizilla body down onto the tabletop and plunged it. The distance from the bottom of the Domizilla fence to the center of the bit is 15mm. So this made it that it was easily repeatable, didn't have to touch the fence, nothing like that. Just put it exactly in the right place. Now the next part of the build was kind of interesting. I had this tube lying around actually a couple weeks before I started this project, and I thought this could be useful for holding on to that octagon. Sure enough it was. So what I did is, if you take a look at this, it's pretty close to where I need it for the bottom of this octagon, but just not quite. So all I did is I just took some MDF and tucked it underneath to get it up to the right height, so that when this would be held, it would be held at the height that I really wanted to design the octagon. So it worked out great. Used a level, just put a little spacer on there so I could see to make sure that this thing was plumb. And honestly, if it's off by a little bit, not a big deal, because as you saw later, we adjusted the level with the feet using the deck of cards. So, a little bit of an error here, no big deal. We're going to be correcting that later. Now, if you measure a distance up from the point up to this side and a point up to this side here, and then you draw a line across, it's going to be basically perpendicular to the center line that you have on the triangle. And I marked that exact line on all of them. They were all at the same height. And then I taped up the octagon temporarily. I placed it inside of the tube. Then what I did is I took this plumb laser and I used this in order to basically get a horizontal line, and then I made sure that the laser went through all of these lines. Now they're faceted, so the laser will touch this corner, and kind of dip underneath that, but that's all okay. You're just looking for an average, and honestly, this relatively inexpensive laser that I was using has a pretty fat line even up close. In fact, I had to digitally enhance the laser so you could even see it on the video. It was that hard to see. So since then, I've picked up Alicia laser. This is an amazing laser. I swear I could burn a hole through my neighbor's house at a distance with this thing. So a laser like this, I'm more able to get myself a horizontal line exactly where I wanted it to lock on. Now this isn't set to gravity right now. I can tilt it all I want. But with gravity, I would have a very clean line to be able to mark where I needed it to be cut. So I used this in order to mock up the height of the table, and then I used it to mark where the legs were going to touch. So I marked where the tops of each of these legs were going to go. And we're going to talk more about that when we get to the leg episode, which will probably be next. So one of the new techniques I tried out on this project was to use the extended plunge depth that the 700 offers, the Domizilla, with respect to actually being able to plunge through two items at the same time so that you get a perfectly kind of synchronized pair of holes. So that's what I did when I plunged into the tip of the leg through the facet that they were being attached to. So this made it really nice that as long as I could spatially orient these correctly, I could pop the mortise right through it. Now, one of the things I did in aligning the legs to these triangles was I set up the sort of mock of the whole table down below here in front of the assembly table, and then I marked on here where the tops of the legs were going to go. So let me go ahead and mark that with a red marker. Now we'll talk about how I determine that when we do the leg episode. So we're going to say that that's where the top of the leg is going to appear. Now something that I did very early on in the build video was when I had the stock for the legs, I took a center scribe and I basically marked center lines on both the long faces. So let me go ahead and mark the center lines on this stock that we're going to use as sample stock. So there we go. These lines here would be being used strictly for my shaping purposes. These lines here were planned well in advance so that after everything was starting to get shaped and look like, an egg-shaped profile back here, I would still be able to locate the center line of the leg if it's properly oriented when it's attached. So let me go ahead and put a piece of blue tape on here to indicate that this is what would be the top surface of the leg. Now, one of the things I used in the project was I used parchment paper. Now, I use a lot of parchment paper in my shop just because nothing really sticks to it. So I can do a glue up and I can just tuck this underneath the part that might ooze out and glue the project to a bench, and it works out really well, especially when you're doing even some small finishing. So I used quite a bit of this actually even in this build video. But one of the things I used here for is that parchment paper is partially transparent, so you can see those lines pretty easily. Maybe not on the camera, but for me it's very easy to see right through this paper. So that's what I used for doing the marking of what we needed to do for the mortises. So let me go ahead and cut a small square of this. Now in the video, the way this worked is I went ahead and I transferred the profile, the end profile of the leg onto the tracing paper. So the triangle wasn't even anywhere in the picture for that. And again, this is going to be a very simplistic profile. It's rectangular. If you had the legs or even anything asymmetric, crazy goofy shape, it's going to work just fine for this technique. So what you're going to do is you're going to put this leg straight down onto the tracing paper, and of course you're going to trace around the outside edge. You don't need to be terribly particular about that part. The one thing you do want to be particular about is you want to transfer these center lines down to the tracing paper. Now here the center lines are still here because I haven't shaped this leg. If you had already shaped this leg, all you would have to do is take the center line that you've exposed down here and move it up to this outside surface, just enough so that you can tell where it is on this tracing. So let me put the center line on the tracing. And just for fun, I'll label this side top so that we know it lines up with this top, since we don't have a rectangle can go either way. So now using this simple tracing, I can transfer it over to the triangle. I can use the triangle's center line that we've drawn on here, and I can align the center line that's on this tracing until it's exactly on that line. And then I can see where I've marked where I want the top of the leg. We'll just make sure that that lines up over here. I'm going to cut a little bit of this tracing away to make it a little bit easier to see. So now what I did is I really wanted to have some screws going to the end of the leg so that when I would do the final assembly of the legs that there would be a screw actually acting as a clamp for it. And also it makes it a little bit easier for when I'm balancing this on the end to be able to do the mortising straight through it, that I have this screw actually holding it in place for me. So there was a bit of a decision of where do I want to put the screw. I can put the screw either on this end or I can put it up here, leaving room for the tenon on the opposite side. So where I chose to put it was I put the screw on the bottom because when I would be assembling it later, the table would be upside down, and then what ends up happening is with the screw up here, the screw is holding the leg tight to the top of the triangle while gravity is holding it tight and snug down here. Now if you have enough room to put 2 screws, knock yourself out. So at this point what I did is I simply drilled a hole straight through where I wanted to have the screw. So all this work so far has been done without actually having the leg attached to it, so it makes it nice and convenient. And if most of your legs are shaped the same, this same tracing can be reused on all of them. So now what we want to do is we want to figure out how are we going to then place this domino in the middle here. What I want to do is I want to center it on this line. So where the position is here, I don't care, but I want it split right on the line. So it'll be in the middle of that. Now the way that we're going to do this plunge is that we're actually going to use the bottom of the fence. That's going to be our edge. So we're going to have the line that we have here, and we're going to place this on there and somehow use the edge of this in order to place the domino. So we're going to use both the edge of this fence and we're going to use the center line on the fence for effectively placing this domino. So the distance between the center of this bit and the bottom of the fence is 15 millimeters, as we took advantage of a little bit earlier in this octagon build. So all I need to do is I need to take this line that I drew and offset it by 15 millimeters, one direction that I want to use. Now this line here is 15 millimeters offset from this line here. Now where do I want to put this domino on the line? Do I want to put down here close to the hole or closer up to the top? So let's just pick a spot here. All I would do is pick a spot, eyeball where the center is of that domino, and then you just carry that out to that line. So here's my offset line, and then here's what's going to be the center of this domino. When we go to do the plunge, and we're not quite there yet, you're going to line up the domino onto that offset line. And then you're going to line up the center line onto what would be the center of the domino. There, I'm already positioned. Now when I do the plunge, I'll be putting it exactly where I targeted the domino. So you have it like this, the way you had it before. Take it and slide it to the back like that. So you're keeping this paper in the same orientation. You're not flipping it around. You're just interchanging them. Now when you're on the back, again, line it up onto the center line, but also now you can go ahead and use the screw hole that you just put on there as a great way of getting this thing lined up properly. Now we're ready to go to attach it to our leg. So the way I did it is I popped it into our Moxon vise. This is my new and improved Moxon vise. I placed the triangle on the top. Now, where it's going to go on the top, the way you have to do that is you look on the underside a little bit to make sure that the center line is lined up with the center line ticks that you have on both sides. And also that the leg stops at the top. So with this here now, it's in the right position. What I did is I just used the exact same screw hole that I had here in order to drill straight into the leg. So with the hole drilled, we can just go ahead and attach this right onto the stock. Now, with the screw hole in there, it can move around. All you got to do is take a look and make sure you get the center lines back on where they are. There we go. Back in the right position. So now it's sitting there holding it for me, which is really great. With the tracing paper, I can actually see where the lines and the holes are going to go for the domino. And then I simply place the domino in the right position. So that would be on that line that's 15 millimeters off, with the crosshairs, the center line, right on the center line of my domino, and then I would go ahead and plunge all the way through. So while it looks like a lot of steps, it actually is pretty easy. It goes pretty quickly once you get going with it. It's mostly a matter of coming up with this thing in the first place. So I'm going to close this episode here now that we've basically built the tapered octagon. We still have the interesting part of cutting it on the bandsaw spatially. So that's going to be our next episode, build a little jig and figure out how we can make some cuts just off of this goofy thing with no square angles. That'll be fun. Hi, I'm Paul Marcel. So today we're going to talk about how to make the tapered octagon in the back of the table. Did I just point at my table's crotch on camera? Not good.